I've always been interested in questions like who am I and what is the mind and all that sort of thing, what is life all about. And I've had two big sources of inspiration in my life. One is Krishnamurti, because he has this very direct and clear perception of what goes on in the human mind. It's unrivaled in my opinion. He's number one in that field, if there are others. And but I'm not going to introduce Krishnamurti because you all know him and so on. But I'll bring him back into the picture in the last part of the presentation. But then there's another field, science. I've always been very interested in science, but especially something called evolutionary biology. It's a branch of biology that deals with evolution. How did we evolve from fairly small creatures, fairly primitive creatures, to the present the human brain, which is arguably one of the most complicated things in the universe that we know of. How does this happen? And especially recently there has been an offshoot of this called evolutionary psychology, because these ideas are so powerful that they move into the humanities of the universities. And I think this is if you look at what is happening, it's a very hot field, this evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. You see many intellectuals that are influenced by these ideas at the moment, and I think it's a very interesting field to follow. So that's why I'm trying to, I'm going to make it simple. It's not going to be a very scientific presentation, but there's one book in particular I've used, and it's called, let's see if I can use that one. Yes, it's called Behaviour, the biology of humans at our best and worst, and it's by a guy called Robert Sapolsky. I think it's fair to introduce him now that I'm using his book. He's not my guru or anything, it's just in spite of the fact he has a beard. But I think he's a great lecturer. He's from Stanford, and he has brought all this material that they have produced during the last 20 years, brought it together, and is able to present it in a way that has made a lot of sense to me, I must say. So I think he's interesting, and from that, a whole new image of what humankind has emerged, for me at least, not completely new, because I've been following the field, but still it's a lot of things have fallen into place, at least how biology regards us, So, but you can see my problem already. I have Krishnamurti, and I think his observations are very accurate. But also I have science and this evolutionary biology, and their observations are also very accurate. They verify everything, they discuss it at great length, they challenge each other. So what comes out of it is often holds water. I think it's really becoming a mature science. Can you understand what I'm saying? Okay, so if there are these two things that I'm interested in, is there some kind of compatibility? Can you see my question? Because I'm not saying, do they say the same thing? I don't like that phrase. No, they're not saying the same thing. But are they to some extent compatible? Do they live each in its own universe? One in a spiritual universe, one is in a physical universe, and they can never come together? Or are they actually observing the same human being, just with in different ways? That would be interesting to know. I'm going to share this question with you, and as you know, I'm not an expert in this field, not at all, and not an expert on Krishnamurti, or I don't think anybody is, and I'm definitely not an expert on this field here. But I've read quite a lot of books, and I think even a layman like me has a right to try to make sense of the world. You know, an ordinary person has a right, and that's what we are doing here. This is not anywhere university, or it's you know, it's for ordinary people. So here goes. This is a map of the tree of life. And it's how, you probably know it, but I'm just going through what evolutionary means, because some people might not remember that word, evolutionary. This is a map of the tree of life. And you can see over here are the plants, the trees and plants, and over here are some snails and mollusks, and here are the insects, and this is all the animals with a backbone. Up here, and we are up here, and you know. So, but there are two things that are interesting here. You can see that that there's an evolution from fairly primitive animals, and the higher up you go, the more advanced in a way. And the same thing goes for the plants. You know, they start by being very primitive, and then become more advanced. And that's the way biologists see this. They have compared all these groups from their function and their functionality and their anatomy and their DNA and all kinds of things, and they have found out that these groups, they sort of belong together. And what is also interesting is that we all life on Earth has a common ancestor. You know, the trees out there, the oaks and so on, are your distant relatives, because we are all made from the same biological building blocks. That's what biology thinks. You know, there's nothing that's not part of biosphere in life. We're all part of that. The insects, us, everything. So that's now I'm going to jump a little bit, because you see, as I said here, on the vertebrates, the animals with a backbone, and up here are the reptiles, the dinosaurs, and you know. At one point, the dinosaurs ruled the earth. They grew to huge sizes, and the dinosaurs are a kind of reptile, like today's reptiles are crocodiles, tortoises, snakes, and here's a Komodo dragon, a wonderful animal, but quite dangerous. It's also endangered, probably. But they grew to huge sizes. But in spite of their sizes, they had a fairly primitive brain, and now we're getting to sort of our subject, that the brain was not simple, because it was quite complex really, but it was basic in the sense that it had to do with urges like hunger, like if you were cold, you sought out some sort of a warm spot in the sun, and if you were sexual, you wanted to mate with somebody. And this is a very basic functionality that we still have. You know, nature doesn't work. It doesn't create anything totally new. It builds on top of something. But then from the reptiles evolved a different animal. It still had the reptile functionality, but it sort of built something on top, and that's the mammal. You can see already that the mammal it has some of the functionality of the reptile, and it has two eyes and all that, but it's a very different animal, because on top of the reptile brain there was another brain that evolved. It was the mammal brain, and it's much more emotional, and you can almost sense that you can relate to a dog or these pandas or whatever, I mean mammals are something like like a lion or mice, or animals with the hairs on their skin and warm-blooded, And they give birth to, often at least, they give birth to live offspring. And so, they feed their offspring with milk. That's why they're called mammals, because, and as I said, they have a whole new set of features in the brain that we have inherited as well. And I'm just going to pick out two very typical ones. One is called oxytocin. That's a hormone. And what it does is that it I'll show you the next picture. It facilitates bonding between mammals. For instance, in this case, between a mother and her offspring. That's the basic functionality of it. But also between grown-ups that fall in love. It's also called the love hormone. It's oxytocin. We're going to return to that. And also, if you have a group of mammals, like a pride of lions or monkeys or whatever, a group of monkeys, they will need to be bonded together to feel a sense of togetherness. So this hormone facilitates that. There are other things. This is a very, very simplified version of what goes on, really. But I can't go into all of it, and I couldn't really. Okay, but then there's another interesting thing about the mammal brain. There's if you are walking, all of a sudden you see a snake. What you do is you jump back, and later on you say, oh, it was just a tweak, or it wasn't dangerous. But there's a very fast reaction, and that's because the signal goes through your eyes. You see a snake, and then it bypasses your cognitive functions as such, your higher functions, and it goes right to something which is called the amygdala. And that's the center of fear, and that immediately activates the whole system. So maybe you run away, and that has been very important for the mammals in order to survive in nature. It's sort of a very quick response. But, as I will return to, it's not very precise. It can somehow, it just sees something that looks a bit like an enemy over there, and it reacts. It doesn't have to be very precise, because there's no time for that. Okay, but the thing about amygdala in the brain is also that it's not only processes fear, but it also triggers aggression. And this is, I think, for most people very intuitive. If a dog is angry, it's probably because it's frightened. So these two emotions are very close together, fear and aggression. And so, yes, and yes, that's about all about aggression. Now we are moving a bit closer to human beings, but we are just we're just going to look at a group of primates called a group of mammals called primates. There are about 400 species, and they include monkeys, apes, and humans. So we're part of that group. And of course they're still mammals, but because they live in trees, generally, they have developed very good hands and very good coordination between hands between hands and eyes. And also they live in groups, and because they live in groups, they have had to develop social skills. And much of the brain, they have a bigger brain. It started growing. Much of that brain has to do with the development of social skills. So we can see it's beginning to look like a human being almost. And also they use tools. It's not a human thing alone. But then, because of this, the cortex started, a part of the brain, the mammal brain, which is called the cortex, started to grow. And when you see a picture of a brain, you can see there's a lot of gray matter around the brain and sort of folded, and that's cortex. In humans it's very big, but it started to grow in the monkeys. And the reason why I mention monkeys and apes is because they're very interesting, because they look so much like us. So lots of anthropologists and evolutionary biologists and so on have studied monkeys and apes to try to find the origin of what we do in our society, in our brains, how we behave. And of course Sapolsky himself studied baboons for 30 years. So, and especially the chimpanzees are our closest relative. It's almost 98% of the same genes as we have, so it's very close actually. And so the chimpanzees live in groups, and like human beings, and these groups are a lot like human societies. Here chimpanzees grooming each other, and because they have something, to take a few things, they have something called a dominance hierarchy. It's very widespread in the animal world. Almost all animals that live in groups have a dominance hierarchy. And what is the purpose of that? Yes, the purpose is that members, all of a group always compete for very limited resources in nature. There's only so much food and shelter, and they have to compete for that. And also for mating opportunities. It's constantly going on all over the animal kingdom. And the chimpanzees are no different there. And instead of every time they meet, they fight, because fighting is very expensive, it's very dangerous, it's not good to fight. Then instead of fighting, they have established a rank among them, so that some individuals are at the bottom and some are on top of the heap. And so if they see a food resource, the highest ranking will claim that it's his and get it without any fight. Or a female that wants to mate, well, the highest ranking will get her, and that means that the highest ranking individuals will get a lot of kids, and the lower rankings won't get any kids. That's how it works among individuals. But of course, also there's this oxytocin hormone. It's still there, and it binds this group together, and they probably, when they're sitting there, they secrete this hormone and find a togetherness. But there is a very perfidious side to this hormone, because it not only strengthens the sense of being together, it also strengthens the disgust they feel for other groups. So it has both functions. So, the more you feel this is my group, I feel good here, the more you dislike the other groups or strangers that want to enter your territory or whatever. That's the way it works. So there's and then there's another thing that's very typical of all animals, but especially chimpanzees. It's this us-them dichotomy. We are our group, they live in groups, and the others, and they feel, you can measure that, they feel disgust for the other groups. They're not really worth thinking about. They're our enemies to begin with, always. So if a monkey sees another monkey, if a chimpanzee sees a strange straggler that enters his territory, the amygdala, our good old amygdala, will be activated. And there's fear and aggression, and instantly he will be in combat mode. And if it's a lone male that's trespassing, they try to catch him and kill him, and they have been documented to eat him. That's because maybe they lack protein. But there's a film on the internet which with David Attenborough, where a group of chimpanzees catch another chimpanzee and eat him. So these nice circus animals, they are not that nice to each other, really. And even what is more, they have been. This is from a chimpanzee war that lasted 4 years, two groups fighting, and they have been observed to exterminate another group of chimpanzees by killing them, and that's what we call genocide among human beings. But they do that as well. So let's see how much. Okay, this is fine. Okay, let's get on to humans, because we are a species of primates that diverged from the rest of the primates about 200,000 years ago. And that may seem like a long time, but it really is a very short time if you talk in evolutionary terms. That means nature hasn't had time to develop something very new, something. We are made out of monkey components, our hands, our eyes, and the brain. It's really a monkey brain, but it's sort of started to grow very much. And we still have the amygdala, fear and aggression, very much so, and we still have oxytocin to mother and child and all that, and we still have dominance hierarchies in all over the world. That's human society is built on that. And we still have groups that dislike each other. That's so obvious. But we also have very great social skills. But something happened 70,000 years ago. There was something around that time. There was something called the cognitive revolution, the great leap forward. And we became human in the way we understand now. We became who we are now, because the brain grew to a certain size and so on. It's still the same. And we started to carve tools from bones instead of just sticks and stones. That means we could carve like very specialized tools like needles and other tools, and we developed language. We could talk together, and we could cooperate by means of language, and also by means of the capacity for long-term planning. That's what really one of the things that makes us human, because it is animals and children and so on don't have this to the same extent that we have, long-term planning. And this is, so in other words, the capacity for thinking evolved, and what is called the prefrontal cortex here started to grow, and that's part of cortex, but it started to grow very much. And our brain is about 3 times as big as a chimpanzee brain. Now, thinking is not totally unheard of in the animal kingdom. Actually, crows, for instance, can analyze a situation, how to get to some food, and they can devise a plan in a number of steps how to get there. So they can almost imagine the future to some extent. If I do this, I'll get a result. And they're quite clever, actually. But humans, of course, have developed this capacity to unprecedented heights, unprecedented levels. And so I'll just take the next picture. In order to act with long-term goals in mind that human beings are very good at, you need two things, at least. You need imagination. That means the ability to form images and project them into the future. That means a sense of time, a sense of future, a sense of gradually working towards some object that you want. And we have been so caught up in this, as you can almost see, that it's our primary mode of operation. And so that explains that capacity to project into the future. And there's there's another thing, that these images can be so lifelike that the amygdala is activated. They can create fear or pleasure or other things in the mind, which is also quite typical of humans, that they can, when they think of something, they almost experience it, and they think to some extent that it's real. Okay, but there's another thing that we need in order to be able to plan with long-term goals in mind, and that's self-control. You have to be able to suppress short-sighted reflective impulses, like I'm passing by, I'm quite hungry, my blood sugar is low, it's communicating to the brain, and I pass by a baker's shop and I see some pastry there, and I say, why don't I treat myself to a cinnamon roll? And but I think, oh no, because I want to be slimmer. So that's a higher ranking goal in my mind. I have this impulse to buy a cinnamon roll, but I want to slim down at the same time. And so you ask your higher priorities, what is right? And he says, well, you should control yourself, not just be so spontaneous. And we're very good at that, actually. That's why human beings have probably gone so far as they have. But in the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, there is a functionality there. In psychological terms, we could call it the executive function, because that can differentiate between conflicting thoughts. Some of the thoughts are good, so it follows them, but some are bad, and it pushes them away. This is the executive function that we have up there. That's also very typical of us. So I think you can recognize something we have talked about a lot here. And science confirms that there are these functions, and so you can make a whole culture based on right and wrong, 10 commandments or whatever and all the children are brought up to choose for that, so that the executive function in the prefrontal cortex, it chooses the right action, the socially acceptable action. That's a part of conditioning, to condition this prefrontal cortex to do the right thing. But there's as Robert Sapolsky puts it, the prefrontal cortex can make you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. When you think it's the right thing to do, you can do something which is not so attractive. Children can't do that usually, or dogs or whatever. We can do that, but there's no guarantee that it's the right thing. It depends on the individual, what he thinks is right, of course. But now there's something that which is interesting at this point, which is one of my main points. Here you have the amygdala, for instance, and there are plenty of other functions. It's hugely complicated. And here we have this prefrontal cortex that can control the amygdala. But the thing is that amygdala and the other functions of the brain can talk back to the prefrontal cortex. Let's say you're very afraid and aggressive, then in the long run, your ideas of the world can change, and you become very extreme in your views, and so it's just one big system. It's not that this system is cleverer than this system, really. It's somewhat cleverer, but both talk back and forth to each other, and the whole thing is one big communication system. And that's something we don't always think about it like that. And so there are no watertight compartments in the brain, and it's one integrated system. Okay, this is okay. Is it very boring? No. Okay. Because some of you may know a lot about this already, but I just want to bring it together because I have some points that I want to make. Okay, humans, I think, and many of these evolutionary evolutionary biologists maybe think the same thing, that humans are a very young and unfinished species. We haven't found our true destination. We are still with one foot in the animal kingdom. And in other words, we are still in an evolutionary situation. We are not very well adapted to life on this earth. We ruin the ecosystems wherever we go and so on. So we're totally confused about what we are. And because a lot of us is still monkey. But one thing I think we can say that all human beings want is we don't want to live as the short and brutish life of an animal. We want a better quality of life all over the earth. And if we see other people have it, at least. And this is not just food and shelter and more medicine and better bathrooms and so on, as Krishnamurti would say. It's also, we think that our quality of life can be improved with political systems, with new criminal justice systems, and actually I'm one of the people, I do believe in this to some extent. I'm glad I was born where I was born in Copenhagen and not many other places where it's a complete mess. There's a welfare system and so on. So it would be hypocrisy not to say there's something good in progress. We live longer, and the chance of dying a violent death has decreased. And this has been proven because of progress. There's far fewer people getting killed in modern societies that are well functioning. But it's just, so it's part of change, I would say that. But I can't imagine a really stable situation when we're always reacting like primates, like monkeys. There's some guy sitting in a high office, and he can press a button, and then a nuclear rocket goes off, and my sweet little hometown can be wiped out. This is not fair. This is not reasonable. So we have a problem with this animal heritage, this aggression and this fear all the time, and this suspicion of the others, and all the things that we have inherited. So we have a great problem of relationships, and me constantly in competition with others, and us in competition with other groups. So the big question they discuss a lot, I think, in evolutionary biology circles and so on, is this a law of nature? Will we always be animals, sort of egotists, and I don't think that these evolutionary biologists are bad people. On the contrary, they're very nice people, and some of them, like Sapolsky, is very concerned with human behavior. That's why he's written this book. He was Jew himself, and he saw what happened and so on. So he was very concerned with that. And but if it is a law of nature, as that some people say, it's so basic. You all want your own children to grow up, and you don't care about the others. This is just a law of nature. In that case, what would be the significance of evolution at all? like Krishnamurti says, would it just be better bathrooms? Just live longer, but we would still be fighting, and I think there's a very good argument against that, and that's if you take that reptile we saw a little while ago, the Komodo dragon, and compare it to a human being, we are far more concerned with our fellow beings. I mean, that we have the capacity for compassion and for good friendship and for lots of things, and for being spiritual, that you would never find in a group of Komodo dragons. I'm almost sure of that, because their brain is like a snake brain or something like that. So there is, evolution goes in that direction, like in our direction. So I think so. But some people will say, but I still think this is a very good argument against this idea that we will always remain what we are and so on. But there's no doubt that we have to contend with this big conditioning, not only the cultural conditioning that Krishnamurti talks a lot about of different groups, but the underlying animal heritage. I think there is an underlying animal heritage for all these groups and so on. And we cannot even think in the world very clearly about the problem, because we are so conditioned by the way we look at other people. Oh, they're entering our territory. We are up in arms all the time. So we are reacting from this background. So I think one of the big questions would be, can we change inwardly? Maybe you agree. But an evolutionary psychologist or an evolutionary biologist would be doubtful, I think, in most cases. They don't do much in this field, but because they take the fact that all human beings on Earth are the same. They speak a language, they hate the other tribe over there. It's all the same. They take that as evidence that it's that is innate, that we're born with it. So this is an issue there to, are we just born the way we are, or can we change? And is our brain the plasticity of the brain so good that we can learn something new? Or this I think lots of people in the world are meeting there. It's not just us. But 70,000 years ago, there was this cognitive revolution, and it was a few people who learned something new, who understood something, and that had a snowball effect. And we are the descendants of them. It's sort of, it could happen, but can it happen again? Or maybe it's already happening, that something new is happening in the human brain. I think we shouldn't, I think this is, if you really listen to what is going on in the world, I think this is plausible. But usually we have progress in the world is always linked to sort of becoming more civilized and being more politically correct, being not harass women sexually and so on, all the things that gradually will make us more civilized. And I'm fully I fully endorse that. I mean, I fully agree with these people that there's no other way of sort of slowly making our way, but it is still fairly superficial. It's like using the good old prefrontal cortex to discipline the mind, saying, taking one thing at a time, you mustn't smoke, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, and hoping one day that you will get more and more perfect human beings. But I think it doesn't change our core. It sort of changes the rule of the game. For instance, if somebody wants to get to the top of his organization, he wants to be executive manager, he knows he can't just slap the behinds of his secretaries or show anger or display of temper. He has to control himself if he wants to. But he still wants to go up. It's not this new tolerance culture is good, but it's still fairly a matter of self-control and fairly superficial, I think, in the way. So, and in the process, by disciplining people all the time, you probably destroy some of that soulfulness, some of the playfulness and all that animals have. You know, we can destroy ourselves on this self-disciplining path. So using the prefrontal cortex to free ourselves from this heavy conditioning may not be the right way. Okay, now I'm going to bring Krishnamurti back into the picture, because Krishnamurti says something completely different, of course. It's not that this hope of disciplining ourselves gradually by reconditioning ourselves with good values, with sort of rational values, because it is really a conditioning of conformity to rational values. That this is the only thing that some scientists come up with. We should all accept more rational values, but what I was going to say? Well, Krishnamurti says something like intelligence is not conforming to an ideal. It's, putting everything in its right place. And in relationship to this, how could that happen? Because when we look at the brain, you see that you can't see it here, but it's one big system, all kinds of centers in there talk to each other. It's a lot like, next picture, this is just a metaphor, I think it's called. Don't take it too far, it's a metaphor. It's a little bit like the weather, the global weather system. How would you understand this? This is, I think it must be hurricanes or something like that, approaching the coast there. This is Middle America, this is America or something. But it doesn't matter, because you can either look at it, and this is practical sometimes. You see, this is, let's say, a hurricane, and it's approaching there, and these are clouds, and this is land, and this is water, and so on. You can theoretically, piece by piece, understand what is going on. But if you really wanted to understand the whole system, to be able to predict the weather, you would need a very strong computer. And even if they don't have that at the moment, but even if they got a very strong computer, it would still be very difficult to really understand the system in real time, the way it moves. And I think, let's say this is a bit like your mind. If you, let's say Krishnamurti says, what brings order in your mind is total awareness. So, and let's say this is your mind, how can you possibly have total awareness of all this? Because it's not a series of objects and events, really. If you really want to know what it is, it's one big system. It's not really a fragmented systems of different objects. It's one big thing moving. Where does it stop? Where does it start? And so it's just one thing moving about, like the human mind in a way. And how can you possibly relate to this, to understand such a mind? First of all, how can you watch your mind at all? How can you observe it? There is, you mean inside the brain, as I said, there are all these things going on, invisible processes, but there is a correlation between the inner processes and your feelings and behavior. So you don't have to know anything about the amygdala and all these things. You can actually just watch your fear. That's the outward expression of what the amygdala is doing. So you can actually watch this whole system. But of course you can't grasp the whole system because there's no sort of fixed point from where you can observe it. And if you try to observe it in, like from one observer with a certain theory, it simply can't understand this system. You can't analyze it. A human being can't analyze his own mind in that sense, because it's not, this analytical process is much too biased and too weak to be able to really capture this thing that is moving all the time. But let's say, one of the reasons why we have these difficulties is because we usually start with a problem, and then we, I mean, if you, not us perhaps, but if you look at the internet and everywhere where people have problems or want to look at the mind, they start with a problem. They want to be told what steps to take. You know, this is very familiar. For 70,000 years we have done it. They want to know how to get to the result. And for instance, there's a sentence I saw on the internet: stop your mind from using you. You have this idea that there's something called me, and you have a mind that's different from me. It's somehow there's me and not me. The mind must, in this sense, stop your mind from using you, must be different from you. Let's say this is you over there, and you trust yourself. There's nothing wrong with me. I have the right ideas and so on. I have a good existence, but there's just this problem of fear and aggression or whatever it is, and it's different from me. We are in watertight compartments there, and this is another thing. This is what you want to be. This is your success, and so you think there are these problems and thoughts and so on as individual things, and the question is, what do I do about them? Because they're different from me, so I must be able to do something about them. And that it does two things. It strengthens this sense of distance, which is really the fear of something, of some kind of intruder in your brain, or the fear of what makes you afraid. It strengthens this sort of attempt to do something, which strengthens the confusion in the mind, because you think you're different from those things and you have to do something about them. And also it prevents you from really understanding what is going on, because all this is you. It's not that you're there and your problems are there. The whole system is you. That's, I think, Krishnamurti's great achievement, that he has seen that you're not something separate from the rest of you, from the mind. You are the whole system. And unless you somehow become very pliable, very observant, you can't have a chance of creating order in this system. I think I'm not very good at explaining this, but Krishnamurti, he's not always very good either. But it's a very difficult thing. But to explain, I don't know if it makes any sense. You think you are there are different entities in your mind, and one entity that you trust has to do something, observe something wrong, and has to do something about it. He talked about it this morning. But I think the way of looking at the mind is sort of supporting his view that it's one big integrated system that you can't really observe from one point, from one observer. I think that's one of my the findings that I don't know. There's just one little thing left, which is also about this idea of the self, because we have a lot of trust in this self, and but the evolutionary scientists don't talk much about the self. It's somehow a word that comes from maybe New Age or the Indian philosophy. They don't really talk much about it, but there are some interesting developments there, because they think that there's nothing up here which is not part of the biosphere. You know, there's nothing here that's not biological. So, but we tend to think of the self as somehow, not separate from the rest of the mind in some way, made of a different material or somehow of a different nature. But there isn't such a thing. They haven't been able to find such a thing. It's all just prefrontal cortex and whatever talking to each other, and we have this idea that there's a self. And then of course the discussion comes up. What about free will? Is there something called free will? And I'm not going into the question myself at the moment because that would be too big. But because there's no self, and your decisions are not made by you. They are made by the prefrontal cortex or the brain. They are made by your brain. Actually, you are informed of the decision a few microseconds after it has been made. You think you have made a decision, but it's actually been made for you by the brain. So let's say that your brain is not very good. Let's say, for instance, you are a child. Your cortex hasn't been fully developed, and that means it doesn't fully develop until you're 25 years old. So you remain rather childish until that time, and you can't really, all the things that we associate with the prefrontal cortex, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong and be have self-control and all that. A child can't do that properly, and also if you're retarded, your brain has been damaged, or you're retarded, or you're insane. You hear voices. So if you are like that, you can avoid death penalty in a courtroom, because if you can say this man is totally crazy, he doesn't know what he's doing. So he can avoid the death penalty. So this has come up in American courtrooms especially, that they try this sort of defense. Well, he didn't know what he was doing. And this is more and more, because they realize, most people who are incarcerated in prisons in the world, at least in the more civilized world, I don't know about prisons in some South American countries and so on. But up here, most of them have some kind of brain damage. So if your brain is damaged, you can't make the right decision. But we expect that. We think that if you're a grown-up and you should be able to make a decision, that means we think there's somebody in there which is not biological, which is not affected by a brain damage or a poorly developed brain, or like a psychopath that maybe he has something wrong with his brain. So there's this sad example of this. There was this German journalist who was fairly ordinary woman, a nice woman, and but one day she had a brain tumor, and and she became very strange. Her personality totally changed, and she became rather aloof and ideological, and didn't treat other people well, and so on. And so she ended by being a terrorist in the Rote Armee Fraktion, and one day she was captured and later found dead in a prison cell. But the interesting thing is that when they buried her, somebody had removed her brain and put it in a laboratory and wanted to examine it. The family didn't know this. They found out later, and the brain was buried alongside Ulrike. But it turned out that the removal of the brain tumor had actually damaged her amygdala. So you can imagine her being in a constant state of rage inside. And so some of these scientists think that this was the reason why she became a terrorist. Some people will say, no, one has a free will and all that. But the biologist would say that it doesn't matter. There's no, in that sense, there may be something called freedom, but not that, in that sense, if your brain is malfunctioning, you will make bad decisions. So there was in one of the articles I saw that they said, well, has brain research then totally dismantled the me? And it seems as if this is, in a way, they don't, and many of these brain researchers, like Sapolsky, says we must change our whole system of criminal justice, because it's not fair that people who have been traumatized in childhood or in a war and so on are sentenced to death, because you need some kind of rehabilitation, because it's not them, it's their brains. So this is a new thing, but I don't know how far they will get with this point of view, because it's also part of animal nature to want to punish people, because we are like that. Okay, I hope you could hang on to some extent, but I think personally, this holistic awareness that Krishnamurti is talking about, as I explained, is the next step in evolution. It's simply that this is the only way the whole globe can live together. And we have to be able to create order and leave behind this animal heritage of, at least of all these bad things. But we will still remain some kind of animal, because if we see a snake, we will still jump. It's not that. It's just that he has a way, or he's just a way of creating order in the brain, which is quite unique. Well, that's it.